Maren Vi had signed her name to the parish register with a hand that would not stop shaking, and told herself the shaking was only the cold. By noon she was a bride, and by dusk she was expected to answer to a name the household of Aldermere Hall had not yet agreed to give her. The carriage that brought her up the long avenue smelled of wet wool and beeswax and, faintly, of the horse's sweat cooling in the frost, and the air outside, when the door was opened for her, carried the flat, dry smell of a harvest that had come in 3 weeks late, and thin straw dust hanging gold in the last of the light. Her hands were bare of rings that mattered, but in the right one, worn smooth as a river stone, she carried the thing her father had left her, a small bone folder, no longer than her palm, its edge rounded from 40 years of creasing paper and leather, his initials scratched crookedly into the underside by his own boyhood hand long before hers. It was worth, by any honest reckoning, nothing at all. She had refused to leave it in the trunk. The Duke of Aldermary came down the steps himself to hand her out, which the coachman told her afterward was not the custom, and his face in that light was composed in the particular way of a man holding something shut by main force, the way you hold a door in a wind. He said her name once, quietly, as though testing whether it still fit her, and then he turned to the row of assembled staff arranged on the gravel like a hand of cards laid face down, and he said that his wife was to be addressed, in this house and by every person in his employ, as Madam, and not as Your Grace, and that he would have no argument about it. The wind took the last word out of his mouth and scattered it. Maren watched 20 faces absorb the instruction and give nothing back. Then a woman near the end of the row, broad through the shoulder. Her keys sewn into her apron like a second set of ribs, came forward and dropped a curtsy so deep it seemed to cost her knees something, and said, in a voice pitched to carry to the stable roof, "Welcome home, Your Grace," and did not so much as glance at the Duke to see how he had taken it. That was Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, and she was the first person in that house to disobey him. Though she would not be the last, and she did it within 30 seconds of the order being given, which Maren would later come to understand was itself a kind of message, delivered over the Duke's head to somebody it was not yet safe to name. She did not sleep well that first night. The room they had given her was handsome and cold, the fire laid but new, and she lay listening to the house settle around her the way a boat settles once it is loaded, small ticks and shifts that were only wood cooling and nothing more, she told herself, though she did not entirely believe it. In the morning Mrs. Pruitt brought her chocolate she had not asked for, and did not want, and sat down uninvited on the end of the bed with the ease of a woman twice her rank, and told her, without preamble, that this house had never in its whole history managed to call anything by the name it was given. There was a goat once, she said, brought up from the home farm for the old Duke's amusement, that the third housekeeper before her had named Bishop as a joke, and by the time the joke had worn thin the whole parish, was calling it His Grace, the goat to its face. And nobody, not even the old Duke, had ever managed to correct them. People will call a thing what they see, Mrs. Pruitt said, however loudly you tell them what to call it instead, and she said it looking directly at Maren, so that Maren understood the goat story was not really about the goat. Maren asked, since they were speaking plainly, why her husband had given the order at all. Mrs. Pruitt's face did something complicated and then settled. That, she said, is a question for him, and not for me, and she said it kindly, which made it worse, because it told Maren there was in fact an answer, and that everyone in the house but her already half suspected its shape. She found Cassian at breakfast, alone at a table built for 20, a single place laid at its head like a man eating at the prow of an empty ship. He rose when she came in, which she had not expected, and drew out her chair himself, which she had expected even less. She asked him, without sitting, why Madam and not the title the parish register now gave her by law. He set down his cup with a care that told her the question had cost him something to hear. "There are reasons," he said, "that I am not able to give you this morning, and I would ask you to trust that they are not the reasons the servants' hall will invent for you by supper." She said that the servants' hall had already invented one, in front of her, on the gravel, before either of them had eaten a meal in this house together. He turned the ring on his smallest finger, a full quarter turn, a small mechanical motion, and did not answer that. Outside the window behind him a weather vane, in the shape of a running hare, fixed to the stable roof long before either of them was born, stood dead still in air, gone suddenly windless, as if the whole morning were holding its breath along with him. Maren did not know yet what the hare would come to mean to her. She only noted, the way she noted the grain of good paper without thinking about it, that a man could look at you the way he was looking at her now, and still be keeping something locked, and that the two things did not, whatever the servants' hall believed, have to be the same wound. She had come to Aldermere from Fembridge, a market town 2 days south by the mail road, where her father Thomas Vye had bound books for 40 years, in a shop that smelled of hide glue and beeswax, and the particular sweetish rot of old paper kept too near a damp wall. He had died in March, owing £11 to a moneylender named Cobb, who had waited exactly 1 week of mourning before sending a man to measure the shop for a new tenant. Maren had sat up 3 nights running with her father's ledgers, trying to make £11 appear out of a business that had never, in her lifetime, held more than £3 at once, and had found, instead of money, only the habits he had left her, the true legacy of a poor tradesman, an eye that could not look at a book's spine without reading, the way another woman might read a face, whether it had been sewn once or sewn twice, whether the thread had been cut clean or cut in temper, whether a signature of pages had been added after the fact by a hand less careful than the one that made the rest. "It is only paper and thread," her father used to say, folding a sheet with 2 clean strokes of the very tool she now carried, "but a binding holds only for as long as somebody means it to, and there is no tool made that can force a stitch to lie." She had thought it a saying for craftsmen. She did not yet know how soon she would need it to be a saying for houses. It was Cassian Thorne, arriving at Cobb's door on the very morning the shop was to be cleared, who had settled the debt in full and married her 11 days later in a church with 4 witnesses and no banns read beyond the minimum the law would permit, and she had said yes to him for reasons she was still, that first week at Aldermere, working out in the dark, turning them over the way she turned the bone folder in her pocket, worn smooth from handling. She thought she had married a man ashamed of what he had bought himself out of pity. She did not yet understand that £11 and a hurried licence were the smallest part of what he had been trying, all along, to protect her from, and that the instruction on the gravel, "Madam, and not your grace," was the first thread of a much older stitch, one begun by his grandfather in a house gone quiet with grief 30 years before either of them had been born, and that somewhere in the muniment room below the library, bound into the spine of a ledger nobody had opened in a generation, her own father's hand was waiting to tell her so. Aldermere revealed itself to Maren the way any closed world reveals itself to a stranger, in small increments of temperature and smell, before it ever offers a fact. The east wing held the cold of a room that had lost the habit of fires. The kitchens, 3 floors below her own chamber, breathed up through the service stair a warm, yeasty fog that told her, more surely than any clock, when bread was proving. She learned the house's geography by scent before she learned it by name, and Mrs. Pruitt, who had appointed herself Maren's guide without being asked, seemed to approve of this method more than she approved of most things a duchess was meant to do. On her third morning, Maren found the library by following the smell of leather gone dry, and stood a long moment on the threshold, with the particular ache of a woman recognising, in a room full of strangers' possessions, the one trade she actually knew. Whole shelves of the estate's older volumes had been let go, their spines cracked, their boards loosened from the text block, the way a tooth loosens in a soft jaw, and she ran her thumb along a run of ledgers bound in the same dull green buckram, feeling before she saw that at least one of them had been rebound at some point by a hand that knew what it was doing, the stitching tight, and even where the others sagged. She did not think, then, to wonder whose hand that had been. She only thought that a room this full of neglect was, for the first time since her father died, a room she knew how to be useful in, and she asked the steward that same afternoon whether the Duke would object to his wife mending books instead of embroidery, and the steward, an elderly man named Harmon, who had clearly never been asked such a question in 30 years of service, said he did not know, madam, but that he would ask, and came back within the hour to say the Duke had laughed, actually laughed, a short surprised sound Harmon reported as though it were a rare bird sighted on the lawn, and had said that his wife might do exactly as she pleased with his grandfather's books, since nobody else in this family had opened one in a generation. That laugh became, over the following fortnight, the single fact about her marriage that Maren returned to when the rest of it felt unbearable. Because Cassian did not laugh often, and she began, without meaning to keep a private tally of the moments that produced it, the way another woman might keep a tally of compliments. He was a careful man, courteous to the household in a way that cost him visibly, precise in his speech the way a man is precise who has learned that carelessness in his position gets other people hurt. He came to the library most evenings, ostensibly to see how the mending progressed, and stayed later than the mending required. And twice she caught him watching her hands work a needle through a text block, with an attention that had nothing to do with the state of his grandfather's library. And both times he looked away first, and both times his hand found the ring on his smallest finger and turned it, a small guilty confession his mouth would not make. She told Mrs. Pruitt one evening that she thought her husband found her presence in his house an embarrassment he was too well bred to voice aloud. Mrs. Pruitt, who was scouring a pan with more force than the pan strictly required, said that in her considerable experience a man ashamed of his wife did not sit up past midnight watching her sew, and that Maren would be doing herself a kindness to stop reading the Duke of Aldermere the way she read one of his broken books, hunting for the one loose thread, when there were whole shelves of him she had not so much as opened yet. The obstacle, when it arrived properly, arrived wearing good boots and an excellent temper. Josiah Wren came up from the estate office in the second week, ostensibly to pay his respects to the new Duchess, and Maren understood within 5 minutes of meeting him that he was the single most dangerous person she had encountered since Cobb's man had come to measure her father's shop for its new tenant. He was perhaps 50, silver at the temples in a way that looked deliberate, and he had a habit of smiling a half-second before the smile reached his eyes, and letting it go a half-second after his eyes had already moved on to something else, so that the warmth of it always arrived and departed slightly out of time with the rest of his face, like a bell struck a moment before the hand that struck it could be seen. He explained without her having asked, the office of agent and trustee for the Aldermere estate accounts, a position his own father had held before him, and his grandfather before that, a small family joke he delivered as though it were entirely without weight. He hoped, he said, that Madam found the house to her liking. He used the word Madam with a courtesy so exact it was itself a kind of insult, underlining the Duke's instruction in front of the very people it had been meant to spare her from. And Marin understood, watching the Dowager Duchess enter the room on his arm a moment later, that the two of them had timed their arrival together on purpose. Honoria Thorne, Dowager Duchess of Aldermere, was 71 years old, and looked at Marin the way a woman looks at a bill she suspects has been added up wrongly. She did not rise, and she did not offer her hand, and she said, in a voice that set each word down whole and separate like coins counted onto a table, that she had known 3 duchesses of this house in her lifetime, and had buried 2 of them, and that she would reserve her opinion of a 4th until she had seen what the 4th was made of. Wren, at her elbow, murmured something about the wisdom of prudence in these matters, an entail being a delicate instrument, and Marin, who did not yet know what an entail was in any detail that mattered, understood only that a room full of educated people had just agreed among themselves, in a language designed to exclude her, that her marriage was a problem requiring careful handling, and that she alone in the room had not been given the terms. It was in that same visit that Lady Cecilia Anstruther arrived, the Earl of Marsh's eldest daughter, whom the whole county had assumed for 2 years would be the next Duchess of Aldermere, and Marin braced for cruelty, and got, instead, something far harder to hold against anyone. Cecilia was tall and fair, and entirely without malice, and she took Marin's hand in both of hers on the drawing-room threshold, and said that she was glad, truly glad, that Cassian had married for whatever he had married for, because the 2 of them had known each other since the nursery, and loved each other the way siblings love each other, which was to say completely and without a single spark of the other kind, and that she had been dreading, for 2 years, a wedding that would have made them both miserable in the politest possible way. She said it lightly, but Marin, who read faces the way her father had read spines, caught the small honest relief underneath the lightness, and believed her instantly, and found, to her own surprise, that she had gained in one afternoon a friend she had not known to look for. That night, alone with Cassian in the small parlour where they had taken, without either of them proposing it, to sitting an hour before bed, Marin asked him plainly what an entail was, and what it had to do with her, and why the Dowager and Mr. Wren spoke of her marriage as though it were a clause still awaiting a signature. He was quiet long enough that she thought he would deflect again, the way he had on the gravel and at breakfast, and then he said, slowly, that his grandfather had written certain conditions into the family settlement many years ago, conditions that governed how and when a new marriage in this house might be publicly proclaimed, and that he was bound to honour them whether or not he agreed with the reasoning behind them, and that he could not yet tell her the reasoning without breaking a confidence that was not entirely his own to break. She asked whose confidence it was then, if not his. He turned the ring on his finger a full slow circle, and said that it belonged, in part, to his mother, who was dead, and in part to his grandmother, who was very much alive and had asked him, years before Marin had ever set foot in this house, never to speak of it without her leave. Marin said, evenly, that she had married a man 3 weeks ago and still did not know the shape of the thing standing between them. He said that he knew it, and that he was sorry for it, and that he would ask her, for now, only to trust that the silence cost him more than it appeared to cost her. It did not feel, in that moment, like the truth. It felt like every well-bred excuse she had heard in her life for treating a poor man's daughter as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be told things, and she went to bed that night colder than the room itself accounted for, turning her father's bone folder over and over in the dark, thinking of his voice telling her that a binding holds only for as long as somebody means it to, and wondering, for the first time since Fenbridge, whether the man she had married meant to hold this one at all. The bargain came a week later, and Maren accepted it the way people generally accept the bargains they will most regret, believing at the time that she was choosing the safer road. Wren had let it be known, through Harmon, that a certain Mr. Cobb of Fenbridge had written to the estate office inquiring whether the late Thomas Vye's remaining small debts, a matter of some shillings owed to a supplier of hide and thread, might now properly be considered the Duchess's personal liability, given her change in circumstance, and that it would reflect poorly on the house if such a triviality became a subject of gossip in the county before the settlement papers were formally enrolled. Cassian, white with a fury he did not raise his voice to express, told her that the safest course, until the enrolment was complete, was for her to keep to the house and the home grounds and decline invitations, so that Wren and men like Cobb had nothing fresh to sharpen their letters on. He said it as protection. She heard it as confirmation, at last, of the thing she had feared since the gravel, that she was an embarrassment to be kept indoors until she could be properly finished, like a piece of furniture sent away to be reupholstered before it was fit to be seen. She agreed to the bargain, because refusing it seemed, that evening, like the one thing that might genuinely hurt him, and she was not yet cruel enough, whatever else she was, to test that theory on a man who had paid Cobb £11 without being asked. She did not know, agreeing, that she was buying herself weeks of isolation inside a house full of people who had already chosen, on the very first evening, to call her by the title her own husband had forbidden, and that the isolation would leave her alone, eventually, with exactly the kind of long, quiet afternoon in which the truth prefers to be found. The task Cassian had given her leave to keep, since it required no travelling and no invitations, was the mending of his grandfather's library, and it was in the 5th week of her marriage, on an afternoon so still the hair on the stable roof had not stirred since dawn, that Maren found the ledger with her father's stitching in it. She knew it before she had read a single word inside, the way she would have known his handwriting across a crowded room. The signatures were sewn on tapes rather than cords, an old-fashioned choice he had always favoured for anything meant to lie flat and last, and the kettle stitch at the head and tail of the spine carried the particular small leftward slant of his left hand. A slant she had watched 1,000 evenings by the shop fire, and never once seen another binder reproduce. She turned the volume over. It was an estate account book, 40 years old by its date, rebound at some point in her father's own working life, years before she was born, years before Cobb, years before Aldemira had any reason at all to know the name Vye. She sat with it a long while before she opened the boards, her thumb tracing the type, even stitching the way another woman might trace a letter from someone long dead, and she thought of her father saying, 100 times over 100 books that were never his own to keep, that a bookbinder puts more honesty into another man's ledger than the man who fills it ever does, because paper does not lie for money, and thread does not lie for love. She had thought it was only a saying. Sitting there in the dry gold light of an empty library, with her father's hand 30 years cold and lying open in her lap regardless, she began, for the first time, to wonder what exactly he had been paid to bind, and for whom, and why a poor tradesman's daughter should have married, of all the men in England, into the one house that had once employed him. It was Mrs. Pruitt, brought in with a tray she had not been asked for, who told her the rest of it, in the manner of a woman who had been waiting a long while for somebody to ask the right question in the right order. She had been under housemaid here herself in the year the old Duchess died, she said, setting the tray down on the very table that held the ledger, and she remembered the binder who had come up from Fenbridge that winter to salvage what the flood in the muniment room had ruined, a quiet, careful man who kept his own counsel and did his work, and went home again without ever once asking who had employed him, or why the old Duke had wanted it done so quickly and so quietly. Maron asked what the old Duke had wanted done. Mrs. Pruitt sat down across from her, uninvited as ever, and said that the old Duchess, Cassian's mother, had been announced to the county as Duchess of Aldermere 3 full days before her marriage settlement was properly signed and witnessed, because she was carrying already and the old Duke could not bear the waiting, and that a cousin of the family, a Wren, had used those 3 unsettled days to bring a legal challenge that came within a hair of costing the whole estate, on the grounds that no valid settlement existed to support the claim of legitimacy the announcement had already made in public. The challenge had failed, in the end, but it had failed slowly and expensively, and had very nearly taken the roof off this house while it was failing, and the old Duke, once it was over, had written into every settlement his family made thereafter a single hard condition: that no marriage in this house should be proclaimed by its true title to the wider world, until the settlement papers were formally enrolled at the county register, however long that enrolment took, and however unkind the waiting looked to anyone who did not know the reason for it. A binding holds only for as long as somebody means it to, Mrs. Pruitt said, not knowing she had borrowed the exact words of a dead bookbinder she had once watched work by lamplight 30 years before. And there is no tool made that can force a house to keep a promise it has already broken once. Maron sat very still with her father's bone folder pressed hard into her palm, feeling the old worn edge of it, and understood, all at once and far too late to have spared herself 5 weeks of silent grief, that the order on the gravel had never once been about shame. She went looking, after that, for the codicil itself, because Mrs. Pruitt's memory, however honest, was not a document, and Maron had learned in her father's shop that a memory could be kind to a family in a way a signed page could not. She found what she was looking for in the muniment room below the library, in a chest that had not, by the dust on its lid, been opened since before her marriage, and there, tucked flat against the spine-board of the very account-book her father had rebound, in a fold so thin she would not have found it had she not been trained her whole life to feel for exactly this kind of irregularity beneath her thumb, was a letter in a hand she did not recognise, sealed with wax gone brittle and grey. She did not open it that afternoon. She sat a long while with it unopened in her lap instead, aware that whatever it said would change, irrevocably, the story she had been telling herself about the man she had married, and aware too, with the particular dread of a woman who has learned to read a house before it speaks, that Josiah Wren's step on the stair outside had a habit, lately, of stopping exactly outside doors he had no obvious business standing near. She opened the letter 3 days later, in the muniment room, by the grey light of a morning that smelled of coming snow though none had yet fallen, and it was in the hand of Isolde Thorne, Cassian's mother, dead these 22 years, and it was addressed not to her husband, but to whichever wife of this house came after her. A letter written, the opening line said, for a woman she would never meet, and could only hope to warn. I was proclaimed before I was protected, the letter read, and I have watched a cousin's greed, dressed up as law, nearly take from my son the roof I gave him, in exchange for the roof I lost my own good name under. And if you are reading this, you have married into a house that would rather look cold to you for a season than lose you to the same hunger that once came for me. Forgive my husband's silence. He learned it from watching mine cost me everything. Marin read it through twice, and then a third time, more slowly, and somewhere in the third reading she understood that the words she had spent 5 weeks resenting, "Madam, and not your grace," had been, all along, the exact shape of a dead woman's love for a daughter-in-law she had never lived to meet, and that Cassian's silence, which she had taken for shame, had in fact been the only inheritance his mother had thought to leave him. A wall built out of grief, and meant, however clumsily, to keep the weather off someone else. She was still sitting with the letter open on her knee, her father's bone folder lying beside it on the chest lid, where she had set it down to break the old wax cleanly, when she heard, behind her, a second sound on the stair, not Cassian's tread and not Mrs. Pruitt's, but the light, unhurried, entirely composed step of a man who had been listening at that door rather longer than he had any right to. Josiah Wren did not pretend surprise. He stood in the doorway, with his hands loosely clasped, and looked first at the open letter, and then at the account ledger lying beside it, its spine turned outward, and something in his face moved very briefly, a flinch so small Marin would not have caught it if she had not spent her whole life learning to read exactly this kind of small, honest flinch in exactly this kind of otherwise governed face. He said that he had wondered how long it would take the new Duchess to find her way to the family's oldest grief, and that he hoped she found it instructive rather than merely upsetting, since grief of that particular vintage tended, in his experience, to be used badly by people who had not lived through the original cost of it. He was not cruel in saying it. That was, Marin thought afterward, the worst part of him, that he never once needed to be cruel to be dangerous. He told her with every appearance of candour that he had spent 30 years managing the accounts that fed and clothed and roofed 400 people who depended on this estate, tenants and labourers, and the very staff who had greeted her so warmly on the gravel, and that a scandal now, of any shape, threatened every one of those 400 livelihoods rather more directly than it threatened hers, and that he would ask her, before she did anything rash with an old woman's letter, to consider who exactly stood to be hurt by haste. It was, she had to admit, turning it over later, a real argument, honestly meant in at least one of its parts, and she did not have an answer for the whole of it, not yet, standing there with her father's stitching still warm under her fingers, and her mother-in-law's grief still wet with new tears on her own face. She only had, in that moment, the ledger itself, and the discrepancy her hands had already found in it 3 pages before Wren's step ever reached the stair. A signature of pages sewn in with a thread that did not match her father's thread at all, added later, by a far clumsier hand, to an account that no longer balanced the way the surrounding pages said it should. She did not tell Wren what she had found. She told Cassian instead, that same evening, and it went worse than she had let herself imagine. He came to her rooms with Mrs. Pruitt's warning already in his ears, that the Duchess had been an hour alone in the muniment room with Mr. Wren, and had come out white and would say nothing to anyone, and by the time he reached Marin's door he had built. Out of 5 weeks of his own silence, and one overheard fragment of Wren's civil menace, repeated second-hand through 3 mouths, an entirely wrong idea of what had passed between his wife and his agent. He asked her, with a coldness she had not heard from him since the gravel, what business she had discussing his mother's letter with Josiah Wren before she had thought to discuss it with her own husband. She said she had not discussed it, that Wren had found her, not the other way about, and that in any case there were larger things now at stake than who had spoken to whom first, a discrepancy in the accounts he administered, pages sewn in a thread that did not match. Cassian, who had spent 5 weeks believing himself the only person in this house entitled to decide when and how the family's oldest wound was handled, heard in that instead an accusation flung at the one man who had, in his experience, never once failed the estate, and said, in the flat, unornamented voice of a man protecting himself from a hurt he has not yet let himself feel, that he thought it best, until the settlement was safely enrolled, that Maren returned to Fenbridge for a time, where Cobb's threats no longer reached, and Wren's suspicions could not follow her, and where she would be, he said, and this was the word that broke something in her. Safe, she heard, in safe exactly what she had heard in Madame on the very first evening, a kindness that could not be told apart, at the distance he insisted on keeping from a door quietly closing. She did not argue with him. She had learned by then that arguing with a closing door only tells you how well it has been hung. She packed the bone folder and her father's letter and left for Fenbridge 2 mornings later, in a coach he arranged and did not ride in, and the last thing she saw of Aldermere Hall, turning to look back once from the gate, was the copper hare on the stable roof standing dead still, in a wind that was, everywhere else that morning, blowing hard enough to strip the last leaves from the avenue. The lowest point of Maren's life at Aldermere was also, she came to understand later, the quietest, because there was no one at her father's shuttered shop in Fenbridge to perform grief in front of, and grief performed for no one at all turns out to be the heaviest kind there is. She sat 3 days in the cold rooms above the empty workbench, with the account ledger she had taken from the muniment room, without asking anyone's leave, its mismatched thread lying open under the window light, and told herself she had done nothing wrong, and felt, despite the telling, entirely wrong regardless, the way a stitch feels wrong even when every thread in it has been counted twice. It was Mrs. Pruitt who came for her, on the 4th day, arriving in a hired trap, with her apron still on under her cloak, as though she had walked straight out of the kitchen, rather than pausing to change, and she did not soften the news she brought. "Mr. Wren," she said, sitting down at Thomas Vy's old workbench without being asked, exactly as she had once sat uninvited on the end of Maren's bed, had gone that very morning before the Dowager and the steward and half the county's better families gathered for the quarter meeting, and had proposed, in the calm, reasonable voice he used for everything, that since the ducal settlement remained unenrolled past the date his own grandfather's codicil allowed, and since the current Duke's household had shown itself, in his words, unequal to managing its own affairs quietly, the trusteeship of the estate's incomes ought properly to revert to the office his family had always held in trust for exactly such an eventuality, effective at Candlemas, 4 days hence. He had, Mrs. Pruitt said, very nearly carried the room, because he was patient and reasonable, and had spent 30 years making himself indispensable to people who did not enjoy doing sums, and because the Duke, still believing his wife to have betrayed some confidence to the very man now moving against him, had sat through the whole proposal with a face like a shut-gate, and said almost nothing. In his own defence, "Somebody," Mrs. Pruitt said, "needs to go back and say the things that man is too proud and too wrong-headed to say for himself, and I am too old and too plain-spoken to be believed by an assembly of gentry, and there is only one other person in that county who has actually read the stitching in that ledger, with her own 2 hands. She did not ask Maren to come. She only sat there at the old workbench, in the cold, waiting, the way she had waited on the gravel 5 weeks before, for someone to decide what this house was going to be called, and Maren understood that she was being offered, for the second time in her life, a chance to choose the harder truth over the easier silence, and that she meant this time to take it. They reached Aldermere on the morning of Candlemas itself, with the first real snow of the year falling thin and dry across the avenue, and the long gallery had been given over to the Quarter Assembly, 40 or more of the county's better families arranged on hired chairs with the dowager enthroned at their head, and Wren standing easy and well pressed beside the table where the estate's ledgers lay already opened for the formal transfer he expected to complete before noon. Cassian stood apart from all of it, near the window, in the particular stillness of a man who has decided that losing with dignity is the only kind of winning left available to him, and his hand, Maren saw from the doorway, was turning the ring on his smallest finger round and round without pause, the only part of him still moving. She walked the length of that gallery, with her father's bone folder in one hand, and Isolde Thorne's letter and the tampered ledger in the other. And the room's noise dropped away in front of her, the way water drops away from a boat's bow, and she did not wait to be given leave to speak. She asked that the ledger currently on that table, the one Mr. Wren proposed to use as evidence of the household's disorder, be laid open beside the one she carried, so that the assembly might see with their own eyes what any binder's daughter could tell them blindfolded by touch alone. That the pages recording the incomes of the last 3 years had been unsewn and resewn with a thread that did not match a single other signature in that book, and that the true accounts, whatever they had once said, had been quietly rearranged to make the estate appear less solvent, and Wren's own management appear rather more necessary than either had ever actually been. "Read it aloud," the dowager said, into the silence that followed, in the flat, commanding voice of a woman who had waited 30 years to hear somebody finally say what she had always privately suspected, so that we are none of us left afterward to argue about what was said and what was only implied. And Maren read the discrepant columns aloud herself, number by number, while Cecilia Anstruther, seated near the front, rose unbidden to confirm that her own father's steward had remarked, more than once at dinner, on sums paid to Mr. Wren's office that never seemed to appear in the parish's own tithe records, a small loose thread she had thought nothing of until this exact moment. Wren's composure held through all of it, courteous and untroubled, right up until the instant Maren set her father's bone folder flat against the spine of the false ledger to show the room how cleanly a genuine stitch parted from a forced one, at which he crossed the space between them in 2 quick steps and reached to snatch the book from her hands before she could finish the demonstration. A single ungoverned lunge that told the whole assembled gallery, more plainly than any column of figures could, exactly how much he had needed that ledger never to be read aloud at all. He did not deny it afterward. He stood very still once Harmon and 2 other men had drawn him back from the table, and something moved behind his eyes that Maren had not seen there before. Not fear exactly, but a kind of tiredness. The look of a man setting down a weight he has carried so long he has forgotten it was ever meant to be temporary. He said, into the room's silence, that his own father had tried this once before him, in the year the old Duchess died, and had failed, and that he had told himself for 30 years he would succeed where his father had not, and that he found, now that the moment had actually arrived, he took no pleasure whatsoever in it, which he supposed was as close to a confession as the room was going to get from him. He asked only, with the last of his composure, that it be recorded he had never once touched a shilling of tenant relief in the bad winters, whatever else the ledger might now say of him, and Cassian, crossing the room at last to stand beside his wife rather than apart from her, said that it would be recorded, because a house that had just spent 30 years failing to protect the truth owed at least that much accuracy to the man it was casting out. Wren left the gallery on his own feet, with a small bow to the dowager that she did not return, and the room he left behind him began, in the particular way of any crowd released from a held breath, to empty itself slowly into the snow-bright morning, until only the family remained. The dowager spoke first, once the last of the county's carriages had crunched away down the drive, and it cost her visibly to do it, each word set down whole, and separate the way Marin had first heard her speak weeks before, though the coins she was counting out now were of a harder currency. She said that she had been the one, after Isolde died, who had begged her son to write the old codicil exactly as harshly as he had written it, because she had watched a marriage proclaimed a day too soon nearly cost her family everything, and had told herself ever since that silence, however cold it looked from the outside, was the only inheritance she had left worth passing down. She said she had misjudged Marin from the gravel onward, taking a bookbinder's daughter for exactly the kind of unsettled haste she had spent 30 years guarding against, and that she had been wrong, and that admitting it in front of her own grandson cost her considerably more than losing the argument with Wren ever had, and that she would none the less say it once, plainly, and not again. It was, Marin thought, the bravest sentence she had heard anyone in that family speak. Cassian did not wait for the room to empty entirely before he spoke to her, though what he said quietly, meant for her alone, even with Mrs. Pruitt and Cecilia still gathering shawls a few yards off. He said that he had sent her away believing her disloyal, and had spent 4 days at Aldermere discovering that the belief had cost him more than her supposed disloyalty ever could have, and that he had learned his silence from a mother who had died trying to protect a marriage with exactly the wrong tool, and that he did not want, whatever this house's history demanded of it, to become his own father's echo, closing doors out of love and calling it protection. "I told you it was for your safety," he said, and it was not entirely a lie, but it was not entirely the truth either, and I did not know, saying it, that I was lying, which he supposed was the family failing, dressed up each generation in slightly better clothes. Marin told him, before she let herself soften toward him entirely, that she would not be sent anywhere again without being told why, that she would not be protected by silence a second time, however well it was meant, and that whatever this house chose to call her from this day forward, it would be because she had chosen it too, and not because a gravel path full of strangers had decided it on her behalf before she had even climbed down from the carriage. He said that those were fair terms, and that he accepted them without a single amendment, and it was the first time in 6 weeks of marriage that she watched him say something, and did not once see his hand move to the ring on his finger, because it was, instead, already reaching for hers. They stood the settlement's remaining formalities in the county register 2 days later, quietly, without the fanfare the codicil had always been designed to postpone, and Cassian told the clerk, once the enrolment was complete and irreversible, and no cousin living or yet to be born could ever again use its absence as a lever, that his wife's title might now be used freely, by anyone, anywhere, beginning that same hour. Word reached Aldermere before the coach did. A year turned before the story settled into the shape it would keep. Snow lay thick and clean on the avenue the morning the whole household gathered again on the gravel where it had all begun, the same 20 faces arranged the same way, though Harmon's hair had gone a shade whiter, and a new hall boy stood at the end of the row where a vacancy had opened, and the copper hair on the stable roof turned, for once, briskly in a wind that smelled of wood smoke rather than harvest dust. Mrs. Pruitt came forward first, as she always did, and dropped the same deep curtsy she had dropped a year before, though this time it was Cassian who spoke before she could, saying, in a voice that carried easily to the stable roof and back, that his wife was to be addressed in this house and by every person in his employ, and by himself first of all, as her Grace the Duchess of Aldermere, and that he would have no argument about it, and there was none, because there had never truly been any. Maren stood on the same step where she had first felt the cold reach up through good boots, and turned the same bone folder over in her pocket, worn a little smoother now for the year's handling, and crouched to press it into the small mittened hand of the hall boy who had lately taken, at her encouragement, to folding paper the way she had once shown him, corner to corner, clean as a first stitch, and told him what her father had told her, that a binding holds only for as long as somebody means it to, and that he was to mean it. Every time, however small the page. Somewhere behind her Mrs. Pruitt was telling Cecilia, who had come up for the season, and would not, this time, be leaving without a wedding of her own to plan, the story of the goat again, embellishing it further with every telling, and Cassian, watching his wife teach a stitch to a child who was not yet his own, but might one day be, reached for her hand without needing, for once, to steady himself first, and the hair above them turned once more into the clean bright wind, and held. If this one kept you by the fire a little longer than you meant to stay tonight, settle in, because that is exactly what these evenings are for. I keep thinking about that folder passed into a child's hand at the very end, about a house that spent 30 years mistaking silence for love before somebody finally read the stitching aloud. And I would love to know which small honest object in your own life has quietly carried a whole story the way that one did. If you want more evenings exactly like this one, warm and unhurried and true right through to the last page, stay close to Jack Circate Channel _name 9, and let the subscribe button be your promise to come back. The kettle is already on for the next one, and there is another tale waiting to be lit the moment the wick catches. Until then, sleep gently, and be kind to whoever is folding paper beside you.